Hi, this is Ms. Wong, and today we're taking notes on cellular respiration and ATP. Remember that one of the big questions for our unit is how do animals get energy from food to move and function? So we've been using that animals use food, they digest their food in the digestive system, so polymers break down into monomers. The monomers go from the small intestine into the bloodstream and get carried around to all the cells in the body. The cells then use those monomers either for biosynthesis or growth or for energy. And when they use monomers for energy, that process is called cellular respiration. We've also used this definition of cellular respiration, the process by which chemical energy that is stored in glucose is transformed so that cells can use it for moving and functioning. If you don't have this definition down yet, you can take it down in your notes. We've taken a look at what happens inside a muscle cell during cellular respiration. With molecule models, we modeled this change, where monomers, glucose, and oxygen gas are carried to the cell by the bloodstream. They undergo a chemical change that then rearranges the atoms from glucose and oxygen into water and carbon dioxide. So we now know what happens to matter in cellular respiration. Glucose reacts with oxygen gas to yield carbon dioxide and water. And here are the chemical formulas. Again, you can take this down in your notes if you want to have this handy to study with. We've also talked about what happens to energy in cellular respiration. Right now, our model is that the chemical energy stored in the high energy bonds of glucose transforms into kinetic and heat or thermal energy when the atoms are rearranged. In other words, chemical energy transforms into kinetic and heat energy. But we're going to move to a more complex model, and our more complex model is going to have this narrative. Chemical energy that's stored in glucose is actually transferred to another molecule called ATP when glucose and oxygen are rearranged into carbon dioxide and water. Then, the chemical energy that's stored in ATP is the energy that transforms into kinetic or heat and thermal energy. So our formula is expanded now. The chemical energy from glucose transforms into usable chemical energy in ATP, and ATP can then be used for kinetic and heat energy in the body. We're going to learn what is useful energy for cells, how do cells transform chemical energy from glucose into this useful energy ATP, and what cellular structures are used to transform energy. So let's talk about this transformation of energy from glucose to energy in ATP. So even though glucose has chemical potential energy, it's in a form that cells can't use. So it turns out that ATP is a molecule that contains chemical energy that cells can use. So to make ATP, the CC and CH bonds in glucose break and reform into low energy bonds in carbon dioxide and water, and the released energy from this chemical reaction goes into making a molecule called ATP. Here's an analogy. If you want to think about energy like money, the energy that you can find in an entire starch molecule is a lot like the money that you can find in a $100,000 bill. So the $100,000 bill has lots of spending potential, but it's too big to use around town, just like starch is too big to get into your bloodstream and be transported to your cells. So what does your body do? Well, it breaks that starch down into individual glucoses, just like if you had a $100,000 bill, you would probably go to the bank and break it down into $100 bills that you can carry on around town. But what if you wanted to go across the street and get some chicken? Well, you don't want to use a $100 bill for that. So even one glucose is too much for cells to use. So with the money, you would probably take that $100 bill back to the bank and break it down into $1 bills that you can actually spend around town. So the cell takes one glucose and harvests the energy from that glucose, transfers it over to this form in ATP, which they can then use for cell processes. So one glucose can actually make a whole bunch of ATP molecules. So what's ATP? Well, it's a molecule made of an adenosine group and a phosphate group. And we're going these simplified forms when we're talking about ATP. Just like monomers and polymers, the adenosine and the phosphate can exist by themselves in the cell. If you attach one phosphate group to an adenosine, then that's called a monophosphate. Two phosphates is called a diphosphate, and three phosphates attached to an adenosine is a triphosphate. We abbreviate these as AMP, adenosine monophosphate, ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So you don't have to memorize the full names of these molecules, just the abbreviations, and the diagrams and names are there to help you visualize how the cell makes ATP. So imagine that inside a cell, you've got a bunch of ADP, which is pretty easy for the cell to make, and you've got a bunch of phosphate groups, which is also really easy for the cell to make. But the cell needs to build ATP, and building ATP takes a little bit more energy. That last phosphate group, it doesn't like to attach to the other two phosphates, so the cell really has to push that last phosphate onto the end of an ADP in order to create ATP. So building ATP requires energy as an input. Then, when you break that last phosphate off of the end of ATP, it results in an energy output. So you can think of it as when that bond breaks, the energy can be released as kinetic energy. ATP has more stored energy or more potential chemical energy than ADP does because that very last bond between the two phosphates contains a lot of chemical potential energy. So there's more energy in this molecule ATP, less energy in this molecule ADP. It turns out that your body cycles back and forth between these two molecules. So you can use ADP in a phosphate group to make ATP, and you can also break ATP, break the phosphate off the end to make ADP and a phosphate group. So how's ATP made? Well, it requires energy. So let's look at the energy and the reactants of cellular respiration. There's energy in the CC and CH bonds of glucose, and it reacts with oxygen gas. And when you, in your molecule models, rearranged those molecules into carbon dioxide and water, the energy in the CC and CH bonds was released. Well, it turns out that the energy from glucose is used to connect the phosphate group to the end of an ADP to make ATP. So again, in your cells, you've got a bunch of ADP and P, and those molecules don't have a lot of energy. But you can make ATP by forcing that phosphate group onto the end of ADP. Where do you get the energy to do that? Well, when your body breaks apart glucose and reacts it with oxygen, the energy released from glucose in that chemical reaction goes towards making the ADP plus the phosphate group into ATP. That very last bond that connects the last phosphate group to the end of the phosphates has a lot of stored potential energy. And this is usable energy for the cell. So the ATP can then go to various parts of the cell, break off its phosphate group, and when that last phosphate group is broken off, then there's a release of energy that can be used for cellular work, and you're back to your two molecules of ADP and a phosphate group. So that entire cycle is here, and you can put this in your notes. So there's a cycle between ADP and ATP as chemical work is converted into energy for cellular work. So how is ATP used around the cell? Well, like I said, the cell makes a bunch of ATP and it goes to different locations where energy is needed. So for example, enzymes in your digestive system are breaking polymers down into monomers all the time through hydrolysis, and this requires work. So the ATP can donate a phosphate group to the enzyme, break down into ADP and phosphate group, and then the energy from that last bond is used to break down molecules. Likewise, ATP is used in biosynthesis. ATP is also used to transport monomers across the cell membrane, and it's also used to move muscles. So when your muscle contracts, the muscle fiber moves because ATP is donating a phosphate group to that muscle fiber, turning into ADP plus the phosphate, and the muscle fiber is able to move. So now we have additional matter inputs and outputs to the process of cellular respiration. We've got glucose and oxygen, but we also have molecules of ADP and a phosphate group going into the process of cellular respiration, and then the outputs, so ADP and the phosphate group, turn into ATP, and the glucose and oxygen turn into carbon dioxide and water. In terms of energy inputs for cellular respiration, so we're still bringing in chemical energy in the bonds of glucose, but the energy outputs now, we want to consider that ATP contains chemical potential energy, and then that chemical potential energy can be used by the cell for kinetic energy or for heat. If we draw it out in terms of a chemical reaction, you can see all of the molecular inputs and the molecular outputs. So ATP is formed when that last phosphate group is attached to the ADP molecule. Where's ATP made? It's made in a little organelle in the cell called the mitochondrion. And cells have many mitochondria. The more energy that a cell needs, the more mitochondria it has. So your muscle cells perhaps have hundreds of mitochondria in a single cell. So this little organelle is the site of cellular respiration, and it's where ATP is made. Once ATP is made in mitochondria, then it's transported to other parts of the cell that need that energy for motion or breaking or building molecules. So again, if we think about it in terms of inputs and outputs of matter, we can see that there are mitochondria in your cells, and glucose and oxygen gas and ADP and P go into the mitochondria. There's a chemical change that occurs, and what comes out of the mitochondria are water, carbon dioxide, and ATP. The ATP then goes to the different parts of the cell to be used for energy, and the water and carbon dioxide can leave the cell, and you can breathe out that carbon dioxide and sometimes the water. Okay, so be ready to discuss and diagram in class. What is ATP and why do cells need ATP? How does cellular respiration result in ATP? What are the matter inputs and outputs of cellular respiration? What are the energy inputs and outputs of cellular respiration? Where does cellular respiration occur? And finally, what questions do you have about cellular respiration? If you have additional questions, you can go back and look at this PowerPoint again, or I've also posted additional videos that would be helpful on the class website. Thanks.